The shuttle cut through Caldera 9's upper cloud layer on a shallow descent, its hull rattling under constant atmospheric pressure. Dane Collar stayed strapped in, his hands steady, eyes on the forward display. He had flown worse drops in worse places, back when the Federation paid him to carry a rifle instead of a scanner. This world did not care about his history, and that suited him fine. Caldera 9 filled the canopy as the clouds thinned. Jagged land masses broke through a rust-colored haze, split by deep ravines and sharp ridge lines. Storm systems crawled along the horizon, slow and heavy, like they were waiting. There was no cities, no lights, no traffic beacons, just terrain that looked hostile even from orbit. He keyed the final descent sequence himself. He had refused an automated landing, refused a support crew, and refused a relay partner. The assignment had been listed as optional, high-risk, long duration, 5 years solo. Most xenobiologists had scrolled past it without a second thought. Dane had accepted it within 3 minutes. The shuttle touched down in a clearing carved between stone outcrops. The landing struts sank several inches into the soil before stabilizing. Dane waited as the engine cooled down, listening to the metal tick. He ran a full environmental scan before unlocking the hatch. The air outside registered breathable but only barely, with spore counts high enough to clog filters if he got careless. He stepped down onto the surface with practiced caution. The ground was dark, threaded with root systems that reacted to pressure tightening under his boots. He shifted his weight and adjusted his stance, making a mental note to flag the area as semi-mobile terrain. The planet wasted no time making its point. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the space that would become his world. Towering plant growth rose in uneven clusters, thick stalks armored with natural barbs. Broad leaves overlapped like shields, some closing slightly as his shadow passed over them. Farther out, something large moved between the trunks, heavy enough to bend growth out of its way. He did not reach for a weapon. He logged the motion and kept scanning. The outpost modules followed, lowered from the shuttle's cargo bay by automated cranes. Dane supervised the placement, setting the habitat against a stone wall to limit approach vectors. Power came online next, then life support, then the containment frame he had insisted on adding to the loadout. Command had questioned that addition. He had ignored the message. When the last system came up green, he removed his helmet and drew in a controlled breath. The air carried no familiar scent, just a dry sharpness that sat at the back of his throat. He did not think about it. Sensory distractions got people killed. He opened a new log entry and began speaking in an even, unhurried tone. Xenobiology Survey, Caldera 9. Primary objective is cataloging native life forms and environmental hazards. Secondary objective is long-term observation without interference. Personal note added for clarity. I chose this assignment because I work better alone. Dane paused, eyes tracking the tree line as something let out a distant low sound that vibrated through the ground rather than the air. He marked the timestamp and continued. This planet has a reputation. I am here to confirm why. He closed the log and went back to work. He moved back to the shuttle and began unloading with a methodical focus. He didn't rush. He had the time. Each crate was lowered by drone and set onto stone where possible. He ignored the soft ground whenever he could. The soil shifted under weight and pressure, tightening in slow waves that suggested intent rather than accident. The habitat frame went up first, anchored directly into the rock face. Dane sealed the seams and brought power online, watching the readouts stabilize one by one. Life support held. Internal pressure held. External sensors flickered as they adjusted to constant motion in the surrounding terrain. Nothing here stayed still for long. He expanded his perimeter in a widening arc, marking hazards as he encountered them. A low cluster of bulbous plants burst open when his shadow passed too close, releasing a cloud of fine particles that ate through exposed area around it. He logged the reaction range and burned the patch from a distance. Several minutes later, The remaining bulbs closed in on the scorched area and began breaking it down. Insects found him soon after. They moved in drifting groups, small and fast with translucent bodies that caught the light just enough to be seen. When one landed on his suit, the fabric stiffened as the creature tried to pierce it. Dane crushed it against his arm and watched it collapse into a thin slurry. Others backed off, but they did not leave. They followed at a careful distance, learning. Farther from the outpost, something large grazed among dense brush. It moved on 4 legs, broad and heavy, with overlapping plates that slid against each other as it fed. He stopped at the edge of its space. The creature lifted its head and fixed him with a wide, unblinking stare. It scraped the ground once with a plated limb and held its ground. Dane stepped back and changed course. The animal returned to foraging, satisfied. Even the grazers here enforced boundaries. By the time he returned, his suit was flagged with minor abrasions and 3 near breaches. Dane reinforced the habitat's lower panels and activated the deterrent field. The low pulse spread outward, barely audible, vibrating through the stone. Several smaller lifeforms scattered, larger shapes did not. As the light dimmed, the planet grew louder. Sounds carried through the terrain rather than the air, traveling in slow waves that his boots picked up before his ears did. Movement increased beyond the clearing. Growth bent and parted, then closed again. He stayed inside and reviewed his data. He pulled up images from earlier surveys from previous fools that came to this planet. Carcasses torn open with clean force. Stones scored with deep marks that did not match any claw pattern he recognized. Tree trunks cut in long arcs, the damage shallow but precise. Whatever had done it had moved fast and with control. Dane tagged the files and leaned back in his chair, eyes on the darkened window. This place did not rely on chance. Every organism pushed, tested, and reacted. Survival here was not passive, it was earned. He opened a new log and spoke without tension or awe. Environmental assessment ongoing. Lethal flora confirmed. Parasitic microfauna confirmed. Territorial megafauna confirmed. Caldera 9 operates on constant pressure. Mistakes are not forgiven. He closed the log and began preparing for the next day, aware that something on this planet was already aware of him. Dane moved along the jagged cliffs with slow, quiet steps, scanning the terrain with a practiced precision. Each rock, each twisted root was a potential hazard, and he treated them all as such. The planet's reputation was not an exaggeration. Shards of stone jutted from the canyon walls like teeth, and dark, viscous sap dripped from the thick trunks of towering flora, forming slick patches that could unseat even a careful climber. Everywhere he looked, Caldera 9 screamed danger. His scanner hummed softly, highlighting traces of movement, imprints, and gouges that suggested the presence of a predator, unlike any he had cataloged before. Ahead, the remains of a large creature lay across the cracked ground. Its ribcage was split, jagged ends jutting upward, and a dark, sticky fluid had dried along the length of its spine. Dane knelt to examine the deep claw marks etched into nearby boulders. Each line was precise, the arcs suggesting both strength and control, the kind of violence that came not from desperation but from practiced intent. He traced the marks carefully with gloved fingers, noting the curvature and depth. This was no ordinary predator. The planet's apex hunter had left its signature, a trail of measured destruction that spoke of an intelligence behind pure animal instinct. The trees nearby bore their own testament. Along the sides of massive trunks, long slices were gouged into the wood, bark shredded and splintered. The pattern repeated in regular intervals, as if a swinging appendage had torn through on multiple passes. He crouched to inspect the grooves, measuring angles and distances between each incision. He tapped the inner bark gently with a scanner probe, recording subtle vibrations, the echoes revealing the mass and velocity of the force that had caused them. All of it pointed to the predator the colonies whispered about, the creature that had earned Caldera 9 its name in the Federation records, the Vornok. Even the smaller fauna showed signs of adaptation to the apex threat. Tiny, armored insects skittered across the surface of fallen rocks, pausing with mechanical precision whenever he approached. Small herbivores with serrated horns and razor-edged claws bolted between shadowed hollows, their movements erratic yet calculated. Every organism in this canyon had evolved to survive in a world dominated by killing efficiency. Dane's mind cataloged and calculated, noting hunting patterns, likely ambush points, and the potential predator-prey hierarchies. But his thoughts kept returning to the clean arcs of claw marks and the systematic devastation across both fauna and flora. He stopped near a fractured rock outcrop and set down the scanner, crouched low to peer across the jagged ravine. Faint scratches along stone surfaces caught the last light of the twin suns, revealing lines almost invisible from a distance. They twisted along the rock like the deliberate strokes of an artist with an instinct for lethal beauty. Dane's pulse quickened, a mixture of awe and caution running through him. The Vornok's presence was undeniable. He could feel the predator's influence in every shadowed recess, every spore-laden gust of wind, every tremor that ran up the canyon floor. The smell of iron and burnt resin lingered in the dry air, sharp but not overpowering, a faint reminder of death past, and the violence etched into the landscape. He traced the claw marks across several boulders, taking measurements, recording density and angle of attack. Nothing about the predator's presence was chaotic. Each strike, each tree gouge, each shredded carcass carried intent. The apex predator was here, moving in ways that left behind a signature in every environment it touched. Dane's mind worked through the implications for the database he was tasked to compile. Each observation, each mark, each trace of life or death added to a growing profile. The Vornok was not just a creature of instinct. It was a calculated force, capable of precision and endurance, a being whose existence reshaped the ecosystem in its image. He logged the data meticulously, aware that any misstep could be fatal. The canyon felt alive, and he moved with respect and wariness, knowing that the apex predator could be closer than he realized. He paused mid-step, scanning a shadowed ledge where the claw marks ended abruptly. Something had moved recently, just enough to shift the dust, disturb the stone flakes. Dane froze, listening to the faint hiss of wind curling around rock. The presence was subtle, invisible, but it carried the weight of lethality. He noted it, careful not to overcommit attention to a single point, balancing caution with observation. The Vornok had been here. It was watching. He exhaled slowly, shoulders tightening as he stepped back from the ledge. Every shredded carcass, every gouged tree, every deep scratch told the same story. The apex predator ruled this canyon, and Dane, alone and exposed, was now cataloging the aftermath of its movements. He recorded the location, the depth of the marks, and the spacing, adding annotations about potential behavioral patterns. The data was invaluable, but so was survival. He took a final careful sweep of the ravine, eyes narrowing against the shifting shadows, then moved onward, leaving the immediate area with heightened awareness, a silent acknowledgement of the hunter that dominated Caldera 9. He moved cautiously along the jagged ravine, the weight of his pack pressing into his shoulders. Every step on the loose gravel carried the risk of slipping and collapsing into the chasm below. The light was dim, filtered through the twisted canopy above, and the shadows moved as if they were alive. A low, uneven growl echoed from deeper within the ravine, a sound almost too soft to notice at first, but distinct enough to halt him mid-step. He froze, hand tightening on the strap of his pack, scanning the terrain. The source revealed itself gradually, a small figure huddled against the jagged rocks, barely more than a shadow itself. Dane's trained eyes adjusted, identifying the telltale signs immediately. Jet-black fur, short and sleek, almost merging with the darkness. Small, broken rings of blue light traced along its spine, faint but unmistakable. Its movements were tentative, calculated. Even in weakness, the creature radiated predatory potential. He recognized the pattern of injuries immediately. Ripped flesh, ragged edges on limbs, a hind leg bent at an unnatural angle. starvation and shock etched into every line of its body. Its venom-green eyes, wide with fear and confusion, tracked him carefully, pupils dilated and reflective in the scant light. It was a juvenile Vornok. Even in its diminutive form, it dwarfed a large wolf, powerful forelimbs built for traction, rear muscles rippling under glossy fur. Its tail twitched nervously, serrated ridges catching faint glimmers of light, an instinctive warning even in its current state. He crouched slightly, assessing the situation. Standard protocol dictated avoidance. Leave it. Do not interfere. Vornoks were Tier Omega apex predators. One mistake could be fatal. But instinct and a stubborn impulse gnawed at him, overriding every survival reflex he had spent years hunting. The creature's breathing was shallow and labored. A mix of ragged whines and guttural clicks escaped its throat. Dane recognized the sounds from reference files. Distress, hunger, pain, and caution intertwined. It shifted its body slightly, testing the ground, flinching at every minor rock slide. He noted the way its paw flexed, claws splayed, the small amount of bone plating along its back already flaring instinctively. Even injured, it retained the defensive and offensive markers of its species. A misstep, a wrong gesture, and it could snap, claws or teeth taking more than flesh. Dane's mind calculated options rapidly: sedation, containment, medical assessment. He unzipped his pack, revealing the small tranquilizer injector he had brought as part of emergency protocols for wildlife encounters. His movements were deliberate, slow, keeping his shadow from overlapping the juvenile's line of sight. The creature's ears twitched, scanning, reacting to the faintest of noises, the lightest touch of wind. He murmured softly, tone calm and low, "Easy, it's just me." Nothing else, no sudden movement. The Vornok's tail stilled, eyes narrowing slightly, calculating. A predator even in weakness. He jabbed the injector, a small, precise dose, aimed for immediate sedation without harming fragile systems. The juvenile flinched violently, claws scraping against stone, emitting a high-pitched shriek. Its body tensed, muscles rippling, but Dane held his ground, grounding himself against the low wall of rock. The creature's eyes began to flutter, pupils contracting as the sedative coursed through its veins. Within moments, its struggle weakened, and it collapsed awkwardly against the rocky floor, breathing unevenly. He exhaled slowly, relief tempered by the sharp awareness of what he had just risked. Dragging it back toward his outpost was done carefully. He wrapped the juvenile in reinforced fabric to shield his hands from claws and spikes, keeping it low and supported. Each step was precise, anticipating any reflexive thrash or bite. Its small growls vibrated through the wrapping, a reminder that even this injured cub carried the essence of lethal force. The journey back was tense, every shadow a potential threat to both of them, every movement of rocks or wind a warning. By the time he reached the perimeter of his outpost, he was exhausted, muscles burning, but the Vornok remained unconscious. Dane set it down gently inside the containment unit, reinforced walls already prepped for emergencies, and took a moment to study it fully. A juvenile, yes, but every feature, bone spikes, tail ridges, ghost stripping, predatory posture, marked it as a living terror, and Dane knew he had crossed a line no human was supposed to. He whispered to himself, voice steady but low, "This is crazy." This was no longer a protocol decision. This was instinct, curiosity, and something like responsibility combined. The juvenile stirred slightly, a soft hiss escaping as its eyelids twitched, but it remained contained, unaware of the storm it would one day become. He stepped back, surveying the containment area and already planning the next steps in a process that would test his limits far beyond anything he had trained for. Every instinct screamed to obey protocol. Leave it to die, never interfere, never touch. He had memorized these rules during every mission, drilled them into his muscle memory, yet his heart beat in defiance of them. The juvenile Vornok lay sprawled, its forelimbs crooked beneath its weight, ribcage rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. He could feel the weight of decision pressing into his chest, the familiar tension of survival training bristling in his nerves. Kill it. Leave it, protocol demanded detachment. He forced himself to take slow, even breaths, forcing clarity into the storm of thought. Then the Vornok's head lifted, tiny eyes widening, reflecting an almost preternatural glow of venom-green intelligence. Its gaze pinned him, raw, unfiltered, instinctive, and alive. Dane caught the flicker of fear, the sharp spike of confusion, the faint quiver of hunger-driven desperation. He could see the muscle fibers trembling beneath the sleek, velvet-thin fur, see the subtle arching of its spine as it tried to gather strength. It was a predator, yes, a tier omega apex, yet here it lay stripped to the fragility of youth. Something shifted inside Dane, a pull he couldn't rationalize. He muttered under his breath, almost unconsciously, "This is crazy." The words seemed absurd, absurdly human in a place defined by survival and calculated risk. The Vornok flinched at the sound, ears flattening, tail flicking sharply. Its claws dug into the metal, leaving tiny scratches. Dane didn't flinch. He crouched lower, careful not to make sudden movements, careful not to trigger the reflexive predator lunge that could end him before he could act. The creature's faintly glowing stripping shone in the light, revealing the contours of its young but heavily armored shoulders, the hint of cranial spikes forming along its brow, and the serrated line of ridges on its tail, even in miniature, built for lethal precision. Every detail was a reminder that this was not a pet. This was the galaxy's nightmare, reduced to a fragile cub by circumstance. Decision crystallized in Dane's mind. Protocol, rules, fear, they all fell aside. This was survival in its rawest form, not his own but the creature. He exhaled and activated the sedative injector, carefully aiming for a muscle group that would minimize trauma. The juvenile whined, a low guttural sound vibrating through its tiny frame, sharp and frantic, tail lashing in confusion. The sedative entered, a small hiss as the liquid entered the cub's bloodstream. Its eyes widened, the last sparks of resistance flaring as it tried to rise, then faltered. It collapsed back into the floor of the containment unit, limbs twitching, claws scraping along the metal. It was breathing now in long, shallow cycles, eyelids fluttering, the glow of its vertical pupils fading as the sedative took hold. Carefully, he adjusted the positioning of its small body, cradling it as best he could with reinforced gloves, feeling the tiny weight, surprisingly heavy for a creature that had already developed bone plating and spinal ridges even in youth. Every small rise and fall of its chest carried with it the tension of unbroken potential, the promise of a predator that could one day reshape the ecosystem of Caldera 9. He secured the containment unit again. The juvenile Vornok was alive. It was his responsibility now. For the first time in years, Dane felt a flicker of something that was not isolation, not detachment, but a raw, dangerous thread of connection, fragile but undeniable, stretching between man and beast. In that quiet moment, he felt the first stirrings of a bond that could change everything. Survival, trust, and the untamable had collided. Dane had chosen to step into the storm. The juvenile Vornok came awake inside the containment unit with no warning that he could detect. One moment the monitors showed shallow breathing and weak neural activity, and the next the restraint screamed under sudden force as the creature thrashed against the reinforced frame. Dane was standing too close, focused on the injury along its flank, when the sedation failed completely. The sound it made was not a roar, and it was not a growl in any way he recognized from recorded data. It was a raw, grinding sound pushed out through damaged lungs, thick with pain and panic, and it vibrated through the unit walls hard enough to rattle the equipment bolted to the floor. The creature slammed its head forward, bone spikes striking the inner plating with a sharp crack that made Dane flinch despite himself. The juvenile was smaller than an adult Vornok, but the difference did not matter at this distance. Muscle bunched under jet-black skin as it twisted, claws scraping metal, tail ridges slashing in blind arcs that scored the containment shell. One strike clipped the edge of the access frame and peeled a strip of alloy away like bark from dead wood. Dane's pulse spiked as every survival instinct he had screamed the same message. He had misjudged the recovery window. The creature's eyes locked on him through the barrier, venom green and wide, pupils blown open in pure fear. It did not see a rescuer, a scientist, or a handler, because all it could see was a threat inside striking range. The juvenile lunged again, driving its full weight forward, and the containment unit slid nearly half a meter across the stone floor before the anchors caught. Dane moved without thinking, backing away while keeping his body angled, hands open and visible even though he knew the gesture meant nothing to something that had never seen a human before. He reached for the emergency release on the outer barrier, but the creature anticipated the motion and struck again, bone spikes hammering the same point with enough force to make the frame buckle inward. The outer barrier failed with a shriek of tearing metal. Dane dove sideways as a claw punched through the gap where his torso had been a second earlier. The talons carved deep gouges into the floor, sending fragments of stone skittering across the room. He rolled, came up hard against a workbench, and felt the impact jar his shoulder. Pain flared, sharp and distracting, but he stayed upright because stopping meant dying. The juvenile dragged itself halfway out of the containment unit, hind leg buckling under its own weight as the untreated injury screamed for attention it could not afford. That weakness bought him exactly one chance. He slammed the manual override on the secondary barrier and threw himself through the doorway as it dropped between them with a heavy crash. The creature hit the barrier a heartbeat later, bone plating and muscle colliding with enough force to bow the metal out. He kept moving until he hit the far wall, chest heaving, vision tunneling as adrenaline burned through him. Behind the barrier, the juvenile Vornok snarled and struck again, then faltered as pain finally cut through the panic. It slumped against the fallen restraint frame, breathing hard, eyes never leaving Dane's position. He stayed where he was, pressed flat against the wall, watching the creature watch him, fully aware that if the barrier failed there would be no third escape. He had chosen to interfere. Now the planet was making him pay for that choice. The days that followed settled into a tense rhythm that forced Dane to slow down whether he liked it or not. He adjusted the containment unit piece by piece, reinforcing stress points, replacing warped plating, and rerouting power so that no single failure could open a path between him and the creature inside. Every movement he made was deliberate, because haste had nearly gotten him killed once already. Feeding became the first test of patience. Dane did not approach the unit directly, and he never opened a line of sight without a barrier between them. He slid nutrient blocks through a reinforced slot and waited, watching how the young Vornok reacted before committing to the next step. Some days it lunged at the opening, striking hard enough to shake the frame. Other days it stayed back, eyes fixed on him, body tight with tension, as if deciding whether hunger outweighed fear. He logged everything, not out of habit but out of necessity. The way its bone plates lifted along the spine when it felt threatened became an early warning he learned to respect. The low vibration in its chest, felt more than heard, signaled stress rather than aggression. When it went still, muscles locked and tail rigid, Dane knew to stop moving and wait it out instead of pushing forward. Observation turned into pattern recognition, and pattern recognition turned into something closer to understanding. The young Vornok reacted differently to sound than to motion, tracking vibrations through the floor faster than anything he had studied before. It responded to tone shifts in his voice even when it could not see him, calming slightly when he spoke evenly and flaring again when his stress leaked through despite his efforts. Dane kept his distance, but he stayed present. He spoke while he worked, narrating simple tasks, not because he believed the creature understood language, but because silence made the tension worse for both of them. Over time, the lunges grew less frequent. The strikes against the unit lost some of their blind force and became more measured, as if the creature was testing rather than attacking. The injury along its flank slowed everything. Pain changed its behavior, shortening its temper and draining its strength in uneven waves. Dane adjusted feeding times around that reality, offering smaller amounts more often, giving its body a chance to recover without triggering defensive overload. When the creature finally ate without striking the barrier first, He logged the moment with shaking hands and did not allow himself to celebrate out loud. Trust did not arrive in a clean moment. It crept in through repetition, through days where nothing went wrong, and through nights where the young Vornok slept instead of packing. He learned the difference between rest and collapse, between curiosity and readiness to kill, and he shaped his actions around those lines because crossing them even once could undo everything. By the end of the first week, the containment unit no longer felt like a battlefield every time he approached it. It felt like a negotiation that reset itself daily, fragile and unfinished, but real. Dane understood one thing with absolute clarity as he closed out the latest log entry. This was no longer about observation alone, because the creature inside was learning him as carefully as he was learning it. Weeks went by in routine. He continued his assignment, but this young predator he had taken it had filled up his time more than the mission he had came here to do. Dane was a xenobiologist after all, and studying the planet's fauna was his mission, regardless of the Omega-level threat or otherwise. The change was subtle enough that Dane almost missed it, because he was not looking for recognition, and he was not ready to believe it if it happened. He was standing at the secondary barrier, updating a damage log, when he spoke without thinking and noticed the creature react before he finished the sentence. He had been talking steadily for days, keeping his voice even and unforced, using it as a constant presence rather than a tool. Most of the time, the young Vornok ignored the sound beyond tracking its source, eyes following the vibration through the floor and the walls. This time, when Dane spoke, the creature shifted its head first instead of its body, and the movement stopped halfway as if it was listening rather than preparing to strike. Dane froze in place and did not move his hands, because sudden motion would break whatever fragile line had just formed. He spoke again, slower now, keeping the same tone he used when feeding or logging data. The creature's eyes stayed on him, but the bone plates along its spine did not lift, and the tail remained still against the floor. That was new. He tested it carefully over the next few hours, never pushing past that thin edge. When he spoke, the creature tracked him more precisely, turning its head instead of its whole frame, responding to the sound rather than the threat. When he stopped talking, the tension crept back in, posture tightening as if the silence unsettled it more than the noise. Dane leaned back against the wall outside the barrier and let out a quiet breath he had been holding without realizing it. He did not call it understanding, because that would be dishonest, but he could not ignore the pattern forming in front of him. The young Vornok was beginning to associate his voice with something other than danger. The name slipped out by accident. He was reviewing footage from the last feeding cycle when the creature approached the barrier without striking it first, head lowered slightly as it focused on the slot where food appeared. The moment carried a strange weight, and the tension in his chest needed somewhere to go, so he spoke without filtering the thought. "You look like a Milo." The creature paused. It did not lunge. It did not flare its plates. Its head lifted a fraction, eyes narrowing as it fixed on him through the reinforced panel. Dane's pulse spiked as he waited to see if he had crossed a line he could not step back from. He said the name again, keeping his voice level and unchallenging, as if repeating a data label rather than claiming ownership. The sound carried through the barrier, and the creature shifted its weight, tail tapping the floor once in a slow, uncertain motion. Dane swallowed and forced himself not to smile. Over the next 2 days, he used the name sparingly, never pairing it with commands and never raising his voice. The response was inconsistent at first, but it was there. When he spoke the name, the young Vornok oriented toward him faster, eyes finding his position even when other sounds competed for attention. The reaction was not obedience and it was not affection, but it was recognition. That was enough. Dane logged the change with careful language and no commentary, because he knew better than to dress the moment up as something it was not. Still, when he closed the file and looked back at the containment unit, he found himself using the name again without thinking, testing the sound like a bridge laid across open space. The creature looked back at him, steady and alert, and did not strike the barrier. The name stayed. Dane had been hesitant at first, holding his hand just above the reinforced barrier, testing Milo's reactions with the smallest, most deliberate gestures he could manage. Each day blurred into the next. Milo's injuries had healed fast, faster than he had expected. He associated this to the creature's evolutionary biology to hunt or be hunted. A weak predator, apex species or not, was a dead predator on Kaldura 9. The routines grinding into a pattern of observation, feeding, and cautious engagement, but this morning felt different. Milo's head, normally a restless blur of shadows and restless motion, tilted toward him and remained still as Dane edged closer. The creature's eyes, vivid venom green, tracked his movements without the twitching, nervous reflexes that had defined every encounter up to this point. Its tail, a serrated weapon that had thrashed with lethal intent the day it awoke, now lay relaxed against the floor, ridges humming faintly but without threat. Dane swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. He extended a gloved hand, moving slowly so as not to startle Milo. The creature flinched only once, a minimal, almost imperceptible quiver in its shoulder, but it did not pull away. Dane's breath hitched in a quiet, controlled exhale. He placed his palm against the dense, matte-black plating on the young Vornok's shoulder. The bone was warm beneath his touch, surprisingly smooth despite the spines and ridges meant for combat and defense. He let his hand linger, careful not to press or provoke, and watched the ghost-stripe rings along Milo's spine shift slightly as the creature's muscles relaxed. The significance of the moment struck him in a way that almost made his knees weak. This was more than survival instinct. This was a cautious, deliberate choice by a creature that should have been untouchable, unapproachable, and lethal. Milo's eyes locked on his, pupils narrow and intense, yet there was no aggression. No flaring of the cranial spikes, no hissing breath, no rise in the tail's tension. It was a small act of trust, but monumental in its implications. Dane allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible nod. For the first time, he spoke Milo's name softly, testing the connection that had been forming in the shadows of fear and feeding sessions. "Milo," he said. The sound was low, even, and deliberate, devoid of command or expectation, just a label, a presence, a recognition. Milo's head turned slightly, tilting in acknowledgement, not obedience, not subservience, recognition. Dane's heart thumped unevenly. Every muscle in his body tensed and relaxed in rhythm with the slow, careful acceptance forming between them. He held the contact longer, tracing a line down the shoulder, plating with the tip of his gloved fingers, cautious, intentional, every second counting. Milo's body remained still, and when he shifted slightly to adjust his weight, the movement was smooth, not reactionary. The young Vornok tested the barrier, not by striking but by pressing a flank against it with quiet pressure, as though assessing the permanence of Dane's presence in its world. He let it happen, hand resting lightly, pulse steady, knowing that any sudden movement could undo the fragile breakthrough they had achieved. Dane pulled back slightly, never breaking eye contact. Milo followed the motion with his gaze, head tilting, ears moving in tandem. It was a silent agreement of sorts, unspoken and unprecedented. Milo had allowed a human, him, to touch the armor designed to deflect, to protect, and to kill. He felt the gravity of that choice sink deep into him, heavier than the oppressive alien sky outside the containment unit. Every instinct he had been trained to obey, every protocol drilled into his muscles and mind, screamed that he was tempting disaster. Yet the creature, the apex predator that had terrorized his mind since its discovery, now regarded him with measured curiosity instead of feral intent. He withdrew his hand slowly, leaving a fraction of warmth on the bone-plated shoulder, and stepped back to the reinforced barrier. Milo's head followed, eyes never leaving him, the faint ghost-ring markings along his spine shimmering briefly as light caught them. There was a rhythm forming, fragile but undeniable, a cadence of recognition, and a tentative bridge between hunter and human. He exhaled quietly, feeling both exhaustion and exhilaration at the weight of this historic moment. For the first time since bringing the creature into his outpost, he dared to hope. The breakthrough was undeniable. Milo had not attacked, he had allowed the touch. Dane adjusted his stance, fingertips brushing against the edge of his own restraint, and whispered again, quieter this time, almost to himself. "Good, that's good, Milo." The creature responded with a low, almost imperceptible rumble, vibrating through the plating, a sound that resonated like a quiet acknowledgement. It was subtle, but it was there. Trust was forming. The impossible was happening. Dane stepped back fully now, giving Milo room, but the young Vornok remained in place, head angled toward him, tail relaxed, muscles loose yet ready. This moment, this single act of acceptance, represented a chasm crossed, a barrier shattered, and a new path forged. Dane realized the size of it. No human had ever been allowed to touch a Vornok in this way and survive. Milo had chosen this interaction. That choice, unforced and deliberate, was everything. He logged the observation carefully, nodding posture, response time, subtle changes in eye dilation and tail tension. The data was meticulous, clinical, but underneath it all, Dane knew he had just witnessed the first true act of trust, the first step in a bond that would define everything to come. Milo's eyes never left his as the session ended, and Dane felt the silent acknowledgement pulse between them, heavy with possibility, fragile, yet unbreakable in that instant. This was the moment when fear became fascination, and fascination became connection. Milo, the apex predator feared across the galaxy, had offered the first true signal that he would accept Dane, not as prey, not as a threat, but as a presence in his world. He exhaled, a smile threatening at the corner of his lips, because history had shifted in the span of a single, measured touch. This was more than survival. This was the first moment of partnership. Dane had set up a small training area behind the reinforced containment, a sectioned-off platform lined with climbing supports, scent posts, and motion obstacles meant to simulate the kind of unpredictable terrain Milo would naturally encounter in the wild. The young Vornok had already shown the first signs of recognition, allowing a human touch, responding to his voice, but the lethality was still there. Every movement Milo made carried the weight of a predator, measured and precise, and always aware. His claws scraped the metal floor, producing a faint, chilling rasp, and his tail lashed with subtle intent whenever Dane shifted his position too quickly. The trust they had established was fragile, more of a tentative handshake than a bond, and Dane approached each session with careful preparation and an acute awareness of the danger. The first exercises were simple: follow the hand, stay, and approach. Milo's reactions were inconsistent. Some moments he responded perfectly, moving fluidly between obstacles with surprising agility. Other times his instinct would override the training, and he would lunge, claws scraping dangerously close to the barrier, or hiss, a low, sonorous rumble that shook the floor beneath Dane's boots. The unpredictability was expected. This was a predator bred to kill and dominate, and he never allowed himself to become complacent. He made adjustments in real time, shifting hand signals, offering rewards through controlled feeding, and always keeping a physical barrier between them when Milo's tension spiked. Weeks blurred into months. He kept meticulous logs, noting how Milo flinched at sudden movements, how the tail ridges flexed when approached too quickly, how the ghost stripes along his body shifted in ways that betrayed heightened alertness or aggression. Every day was a negotiation, a cautious testing of limits, and he was careful to respect the creature's autonomy. There was no rush, no force, only the slow shaping of responses, repetition of commands, and the introduction of environmental cues that allowed Milo to make the connection between stimulus and consequence. Even the smallest successes were significant: a halt at a hand signal, a pause before striking a moving object, a measured step toward a platform rather than an impulsive leap. By the time he began structured exercises, climbing on cue, tracking specific scents, holding position under pressure, Milo's responses were still uneven. Sometimes the apex predator moved like a trained companion, Other times, his muscles coiled with lethal potential and his eyes glimmered with a predator's calculation. Dane would step back, recalibrate, and continue, refusing to let frustration seep in. Progress wasn't linear, and Milo's lethality was a constant reminder that one misstep could undo weeks of work. But slowly, incrementally, the young Vornok began to tolerate new commands, internalizing the basic expectations. A significant breakthrough didn't come until 3 months into the training. Dane had set up a scent trail through the climbing supports, intended to test Milo's ability to follow a controlled path without giving in to impulse. The creature hesitated at the start, muscles taut, ears flicking toward every sound, every vibration in the platform. Dane called softly, guiding the movement with gestures reinforced by scent rewards. Milo took the first step, claws scraping but landing precisely. Step by step, he navigated the course, occasionally testing boundaries by pausing to assess threats or leaping ahead instinctively, but each time returning to the pattern he had introduced. By the end of the trail, Milo had completed the course nearly flawlessly, stopping on command, and Dane could feel the subtle shift in their dynamic. The apex predator had begun to understand not just the commands, but the expectation of cooperation, even if the full trust hadn't arrived yet. Time accelerated as months passed, marked by small, incremental improvements. Milo responded more consistently, though his instinctive caution never disappeared. He would still growl if approached too quickly, flare his cranial spikes when startled, or test barriers with tail flicks, reminding Dane that lethal potential was never far beneath the surface. The apex predator had begun to tolerate touch without flinching, follow hand signals with purpose, and climb on cue, but every session reinforced that this was not obedience in the conventional sense. It was cautious collaboration. By the 9th month, Dane initiated the first scent tracking exercise without a barrier between them. Milo followed closely, muscles rippling with power and awareness, scanning the terrain with emerald eyes that narrowed in concentration. He would occasionally glance toward Dane as though seeking confirmation, but never lost focus on the trail. When the exercise ended successfully, he allowed himself the smallest smile, recognizing that months of slow, careful work had transformed a nearly untouchable predator into something approaching a partner, though the apex lethality that defined Milo remained intact. Trust was building, fragile but unmistakable, and Dane knew the next phase, complete responsiveness, was still a long, measured journey, dependent on continued patience, respect, and the unpredictable nature of the creature he had chosen to raise. By the end of the year, Milo could perform the full range of training tasks under controlled conditions: follow, halt, track, climb, and pause on command. Yet every so often, in the shadow of instinct, the creature would test limits. Ears flicking, tail flicking, ghost stripes catching the light, and Dane welcomed these reminders that this apex predator was still, above all else, a lethal force of nature, never fully tamed, only guided. Dane looked over the perimeter of the outpost as Milo padded silently beside him, the faint rasp of claws on hardened soil the only sound that betrayed his massive presence. The young Vornok that had once been a trembling, injured cub had grown into a fully realized apex predator, a creature whose presence alone reshaped the environment around him. The patterns on his body, that translucent blue, shimmered faintly as he moved, an almost imperceptible pulse in the dim alien light. He had never expected the slow, brutal process of training Milo to evolve into the seamless partnership they now shared. Trust had not come quickly. It had been measured and cautious, hard-won over months of observation, testing, and discipline. Milo had learned hand signals, voice commands, scent cues, and the subtle variations of Dane's posture and movement. Yet, despite the training, the creature's lethal potential remained intact. There had been no illusions that this predator could ever be anything less than what it was: a tier Omega apex, one of the deadliest creatures in known space. The landscape of Caldera 9 had become their domain. Dane had marked paths through dense thickets, cliffs, and ravines, noting the positions of carnivorous flora and aggressive herbivores. Milo was always at the forefront, a shadow of controlled menace, moving through jagged undergrowth with a predatory grace that defied his size. When a territorial herbivore charged without warning, Milo would intercept, slashing with his tail ridges or ramming with cranial spikes to neutralize threats before they could reach Dane. He hunted with precision, taking prey efficiently, consuming only what was needed, and always checking back with Dane. Their movements became synchronized, an unspoken understanding that allowed them to traverse the world with unprecedented efficiency. Time passed in strange, irregular leaps. Dane's logs reflected the sporadic flow. Days spent mapping, noting patterns of predatory microfauna, cataloging flora with lethal defense mechanisms. Long stretches of tense stillness as they observed a Vornok or a predator stalking the same hunting ground. Nights when Milo would stalk a scent miles from the outpost, returning at dawn with the faintest gleam of pride in his venom-green eyes. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the slow accumulation of these experiences transformed both human and predator. Dane had watched Milo grow, his body rippling with muscle and armored bone, the apex predator's instincts honed to a razor edge. Yet even as Milo matured into his lethal form, the bond between them deepened. The creature would follow commands instinctively, yet always retain the freedom of thought that marked his species. If a situation demanded instinct over training, Milo acted without hesitation, but always in alignment with Dane's overarching intent. They became a team in the truest sense. Exploration was no longer a solitary endeavor. Milo scouted dangerous cliffs and ravines, his vertical ambushes revealing hidden dangers Dane would have missed. He signaled the approach of venomous predators or aggressive herbivores through subtle vocalizations and shifts in posture, effectively becoming Dane's eyes and ears in the most lethal regions of Kaldera 9. On hunts, Milo would flush prey toward Dane's observation points, sometimes delivering calculated kills that allowed them to study the anatomy and behavior of the local fauna. Dane learned to anticipate Milo's decisions, responding to shifts in the predator's gaze, the flare of cranial spikes, the flex of tail ridges. The partnership was organic, evolving naturally from the years of painstaking trust building, but it remained inherently precarious. Milo's lethal nature was never dulled. It had been integrated into the rhythm of their survival. The time passed and reflected the intensity of their bond. Early weeks were defined by Milo's tentative obedience, hesitation before climbs, flinches when approached too quickly, occasional lunges when instinct overwhelmed training. Months later, Milo could navigate treacherous rock faces with Dane at his back, climbing higher, moving faster, and acting as both protector and guide. Years later, their exploration had taken them across territories once thought impenetrable. Cliffside plateaus where predatory lizards lurked, forests of razor-leaved plants, and ravines crawling with ambush predators. Milo's ability to anticipate, neutralize, and track threats became indispensable. Dane's logs, now more journal than report, reflected moments of awe, watching Milo dispatch a predator twice his size with a single, precise tail strike, observing the subtle glow of his eyes illuminating a cave entrance as if to gauge danger, noting how the apex predator would pause, and then proceed only after confirming Dane's position and safety. Hunting was no longer just survival, it was education, study, and mutual protection. Milo would stalk game silently, bringing it to Dane's chosen observation points, occasionally leaving a kill in place to allow detailed study. The Vornok's senses far exceeded any human capacity: thermal signatures, vibrations in the ground, pheromonal traces left in the air. Dane relied on these instincts, learning from Milo, adapting strategies to keep pace with the planet's lethal inhabitants. Even the most dangerous flora and fauna could be cataloged and avoided, because Milo would sense the presence first, often intercepting before a threat could manifest. Despite the efficiency, trust was not total. Milo remained a predator above all else. Rarely, when Dane misjudged a movement or shifted his stance too abruptly, Milo would flare his cranial spikes, tail ridges vibrating with unspent energy, a warning rather than aggression. These moments reminded him that the apex predator's obedience was conditional, earned, and respected, and never assumed. Yet each incident, rather than breaking the partnership, strengthened it. Dane refined his cues, Milo internalized the parameters of acceptable behavior, and slowly, their synchronization became instinctual. The predator's unpredictability never vanished. It became a measure of respect and awe, a constant reminder that they were not taming a creature, they were shaping a mutual understanding with a living weapon of nature. By the close of Dane's assignment, the outpost had evolved from a solitary station into a hub of calculated domination over Caldera 9. Milo, now fully grown, moved with quiet authority, an apex predator that commanded the land yet remained tethered to Dane's presence. They explored, hunted, defended, and cataloged together, the rhythm of life on the death world molded by their partnership. The years had cemented a bond forged in patience, fear, respect, and understanding, a human and a monster, surviving in a world that had never been kind to either. Milo's lethal precision, his pattern of ghost-striped stealth, and his unwavering instinct had become instruments in Dane's mission, yet never compromised the predator's autonomy. As the final day of his assignment approached, Dane stared at the shuttle manifest blinking across the terminal. He could not leave Milo behind, not after years of survival, exploration, and shared danger. The thought of abandoning the creature he had raised, trained, and survived alongside was unthinkable. Every protocol and regulation screamed against it, but Dane's decision was absolute. He typed, fingers deliberate, requesting transport clearance for one adult Vornok. The automated system paused, the blinking cursor feeling almost like a heartbeat in the sterile interface. He double-checked the entry. The request was impossible, preposterous, ridiculous, but there was no hesitation in Dane's mind. Milo was not just a subject, not just a predator, he was a partner, a guardian, and the only companion that had truly survived Caldera 9 with him. Moments later, the confirmation screen flickered, showing command reviewing request. Dane exhaled slowly, knowing full well that the bureaucracy would laugh, dismiss, or outright reject him. He didn't care. The bond they had formed over years of careful observation, disciplined training, and shared survival could not be severed by administrative decree. Milo circled the outpost perimeter one last time, cranial spikes lowered but eyes glowing faintly, tail ridges twitching with restrained energy, sensing his resolve. When the shuttle arrived, Dane moved with efficiency honed by countless expeditions. Milo followed, silent and obedient, muscles rippling beneath armored plates, every movement precise and controlled. But as the shuttle bay doors began to open, the crew caught sight of the predator first. Chaos erupted instantly. Eyes widened so quickly they seemed to snap, breaths hitched, and the bay became frozen in terror. Security officers stumbled backward, hands twitching toward weapons as if mere reflex might shield them from the creature. Engineers dropped their tools, scrambling to consoles for cover. The automated protocols blinked and screamed, sensors unable to fully quantify the magnitude of the Tier Omega apex in front of them. Milo stepped onto the bay floor with deliberate ease, stripes catching the dim lights in fleeting flashes of eerie blue, tail ridges flexing like a prelude to violence, cranial spikes angled forward just enough to remind anyone watching of the lethal force beneath the calm exterior. The air seemed to thicken. Oppressive with anticipation, each step Milo took drawing a ripple of unease through the humans present. Heartbeats raced, breath caught. Panic threatened to overtake protocol as crew members froze, some stumbling into each other, incapable of processing a predator of this size moving so deliberately beside a single human. Dane stepped forward, voice calm, a stark contrast to the chaos around him. Milo flared his cranial spikes slightly, not as a threat, but a signal of controlled power, a living, breathing apex predator perfectly attuned to Dane's intent. The crew recoiled further, instinct battling disbelief, their minds scrambling to reconcile the impossible. A creature that could shred armored vehicles with ease, a predator so feared that colonies were abandoned at its presence, now moving silently beside a human, obedient to commands that no one else dared utter. For a suspended heartbeat, the shuttle bay was a frozen scene of awe, terror, and incomprehension, as every sensor, every protocol, every human instinct failed to capture the reality of what was happening. The docking bay trembled under the vibrations of the incoming shuttle, lights flickering as alarms screamed their discordant chorus. Dane stepped to the ramp, his hand brushing Milo's sleek black flank, the faint hum of the Vornok's musculature vibrating under his fingertips. As the ramp descended, Milo's massive form emerged, scaling over the threshold like a shadow of predation made flesh. The automated sensors immediately flagged him, classifying him as a Class Omega threat with every scanner, every readout screaming danger. Security personnel froze mid-step. Their rifles lifted, hesitated, and trembled in the unnatural stillness that Milo exuded. Dockworkers scattered with terrified shouts, some tripping over crates, others slamming bulkheads closed. The echoes of startled footsteps ricocheted through the cavernous bay. Civilians shrieked and fell back behind reinforced railings, their eyes wide, faces pale. The emergency lights stuttered as though the bay itself sensed the predator's presence. Every panel, every scanner, every automated system screamed at the impossibility standing before them. Milo's green eyes gleamed with the faint, predatory glow that cut through the shadows of the docking bay. He moved with deliberate calm, each step measured, calculated, unnervingly silent for his size. His tail swung slowly, serrated ridges catching the light in fleeting glimmers, a ghostly warning. The bone plates along his spine and shoulders shifted with subtle clicks, ready, lethal, but relaxed under Dane's touch. He was a mountain of living armor and raw power, and yet at that moment he was obedient, tethered to the quiet authority in Dane's voice. A commander, voice barely a whisper over the panic, let out a stammering question that trembled on disbelief. How is it listening to you?" Dane's expression remained calm, unflinching, his gaze locked with Milo's. He responded simply, without hesitation. "I raised him, he's mine." The words traveled faster than any broadcast. Rumors ignited instantly across the station. Technicians, dock crews, and bystanders repeated them in a stunned chain of disbelief. Crowds swelled at the edges of reinforced glass, pressing faces close, straining to witness the impossible. No one dared step closer. Milo's presence radiated a silent, uncompromising authority. He moved beside Dane with terrifying grace, tail swaying, shoulders low but relaxed, muscles coiled yet dormant. Every motion was precise, deliberate, a predator restrained not by barriers but by choice. Docking bay alarms continued to shriek, but their piercing warnings now mingled with human awe. Those who dared remained frozen, eyes darting between Dane and Milo, heartbeats hammering against their ribs. A young engineer muttered under her breath, voice quivering. "It's huge and it's just sitting there." Milo lowered himself to the ground at Dane's signal, the massive claws folding carefully beneath his weight. The entire bay seemed to exhale in unison, the tension palpable, almost tactile. A silence heavier than the alarms pressed down, as if the station itself held its breath. The absolute lethal power and unquestioning obedience sent waves of shock through everyone present. No one had seen anything like it. Not in field reports, not in xenobiology logs, not in military files. This was a living legend, an apex predator feared across the galaxy, sitting calmly beside a single human. Whispers erupted from all directions, soft but insistent, carrying a mixture of terror and awe. Eyes widened, jaws slackened, and the very air seemed charged with disbelief. Some stumbled back, others held cameras, hands shaking, capturing the impossible feat. Milo's head tilted slightly, ears twitching, eyes locked on Dane, radiating an intelligent, patient awareness. The scene was hypnotic, horrifying, and magnificent. For the first time in the docking bay's history, the humans who had faced alarms, blaring sensors, and countless security protocols were forced to recognize something beyond their calculations. A creature whose danger was absolute, yet whose loyalty and restraint were undeniable. The Federation Council had been alerted automatically, but even before official word reached them, every person present understood that they were witnessing history. The apex predator of a death world, tamed, controlled, and profoundly bonded to one human. And Milo remained perfectly still, obedient. A mountain of lethal grace coiled quietly beside Dane, eyes glowing, spine plates resting, tail swaying with measured calm. The bay held its breath, suspended between terror and wonder, the impossible rendered visible in the shadowed bulk of a predator whose name would echo across the galaxy. The summons arrived as a formal directive stamped with council authority, leaving no room for refusal or negotiation. Dane was ordered to present himself and the Vornok before the Federation Council, not for discussion, but for judgment disguised as procedure. The council chamber fell into stunned silence the moment Milo entered beside him, the massive predator moving with controlled calm under the weight of hundreds of fearful stares. Councilors leaned back in their seats, some gripping armrests, others whispering urgently as security fields surged to full strength around the chamber. When Dane was asked to identify the creature, his answer landed like a misfired joke in a room that did not know how to laugh. He told them the Vornok's name was Milo, and the reaction rippled in confused waves across the chamber. One counselor choked on a breath, another stared as if waiting for the punchline, and a third muttered that the name belonged to a companion animal, not a galaxy-level threat. The contrast between the creature's armored bulk, glowing eyes, and bone-lined silhouette and the simple, almost affectionate name unsettled them more than silence ever could. Milo remained still throughout it all, seated at Dane's side, calm and patient, and utterly uninterested in their fear. The council recessed quickly, issuing a single directive before panic could fracture decorum. If the creature was to remain on the station, it would do so under controlled conditions, and proof of Dane's claims would be required immediately. That order led directly to the arena. The reinforced arena was designed for containment, not trust, and its walls carried the scars of prior tests that had gone wrong. Dane stood at the center of the chamber while observers filled the upper tiers behind layered armor glass, their faces tense, their posture rigid. Scientists whispered into recorders, military officers leaned forward with hands clenched, politicians watched with rehearsed neutrality, and media drones hovered in fixed positions, already broadcasting what they expected to become a controlled disaster. Milo waited at Dane's side, massive frame coiled with disciplined restraint, bone plating settled, tail ridges still, and eyes fixed on him with focused attention. The room fell into a strained quiet as Dane raised his hand, the gesture small but deliberate, and spoke the first command in a steady, unforced tone that carried through the chamber. Milo responded instantly, lowering his massive body to the floor with a controlled grace that sent a ripple of disbelief through the viewing tiers. The floor plates vibrated softly under his weight, yet he remained perfectly still, muscles locked but calm, power contained rather than suppressed. Several observers shifted uneasily, reassessing what they were seeing in real time. Dane did not look at the audience when he gave the second command, his attention remaining solely on Milo as he reinforced the bond they had built over years of survival and training. Milo froze in place, posture rigid, eyes forward, every instinct clearly held in check by discipline rather than fear. The silence deepened, broken only by the faint hum of containment systems and the quiet intake of breath from those watching. What unsettled them most was not the obedience itself, but the ease with which it was given. When Dane issued the next command, the atmosphere changed instantly, and Milo rose to his full height with controlled intensity. Bone plates shifted outward along his spine and shoulders, locking into a defensive posture that radiated lethal intent. The serrated ridges along his tail lifted slightly, vibrating with contained energy, while his stance widened, balanced for violence if called upon. The observers recoiled as one, alarms spiking briefly before being overridden by manual control, the room trembling under the presence of a predator fully prepared to act. He waited until the tension reached its breaking point before giving the final command, his voice calm, precise, and unwavering. Milo responded immediately, the transformation almost jarring in its speed, as bone plates folded back into a resting configuration, and his posture softened without hesitation. The lethal readiness vanished, replaced by controlled stillness and attentive calm, as though the threat had never existed at all. The contrast struck the audience harder than any display of force could have. A wave of hushed murmurs spread through the chamber, disbelief overtaking fear, as the observers struggled to reconcile what they had just witnessed. A creature classified as a Tier Omega apex had shifted from battle-ready dominance to calm restraint on a single word, without resistance, without hesitation, and without failure. One senior officer leaned toward another, voice low and shaken, and spoke a thought that lingered heavily in the air about the strategic implications of such control. Dane heard it clearly, and his expression hardened as understanding settled in. Milo remained steady at his side, eyes locked on him, posture relaxed but alert, the bond between them unmistakable and absolute. The demonstration had achieved its goal, but it had also exposed something far more dangerous than fear. In that moment, the galaxy did not see a tamed monster. It saw potential. The room erupted into whispers. A general muttered, "If we had 10 of these, we could control entire sectors." "Think of the possibilities," Dane heard what the general had said. And he knew what was coming next. The approach did not come from the council chamber, and it did not arrive with debate or ceremony, because Dane knew it came quietly through secured channels that bypassed civilian authority entirely. He read the summons in his assigned quarters, framed as a routine follow-up, though the security tags embedded in the message made the real intent obvious. Milo had to remain outside the chamber behind layered containment fields. Dane objected immediately, but it was clear that refusal would escalate the situation. He gave the signal, and Milo complied, settling into a guarded crouch with his eyes locked on the sealed door, muscles taut and ready. The room was smaller than the council chamber, stripped of spectacle, and Dane noted the absence of observers or media. Only officers in unmarked uniforms stood there, flanked by 2 officials whose insignia marked them as military intelligence. Their posture was relaxed, but Dane recognized the confidence from his own past service before he even sat. There was no preamble, no curiosity or praise. That part had already passed. What remained now was interest sharpened into intent, and Dane felt the weight of it. They began by stating facts he already knew, outlining Milo's classification, combat potential, and demonstrated obedience. Dane's hands rested steady on the table, his expression flat. Letting them lay everything out was more valuable than interrupting. They discussed projected outcomes, controlled breeding programs, battlefield applications, as if Milo were equipment and not a living creature. One officer referred to Milo as an asset, then corrected himself to subject without apology when he stiffened. He caught the subtle shift and understood immediately. Words didn't soften the meaning, only revealed the intent. Dane listened, weighing every syllable, nodding the promise in their tone: resources, protection, status, oversight. Leadership in what they called a necessary evolution of galactic defense. Prevention rather than aggression, they said. Controlled power over unchecked fear. Milo was an opportunity they could not allow to walk away. He felt the weight of it, the sense of calculated inevitability, and he forced himself to keep his expression calm, to keep his hands steady. When they finished, the silence in the room pressed down on him heavier than any threat they had spoken. Dane answered calmly, every word measured. Milo would not be turned over, studied for weaponization, or used as a template for any program. Milo was not property, not a specimen, not a tool. No amount of authority could change that reality. The bond they had witnessed could not be replicated through force or conditioning, and anyone attempting it would fail and violence would be inevitable. He felt the certainty of that in his chest, a cold, iron weight. The change was immediate. Politeness evaporated, replaced by pure calculation. One officer remarked almost casually that refusal carried consequences. Dane saw it for what it was. Another quietly disabled the recording system. Procedure had ended. Contingency had begun, and his mind noted it without flinch. The meeting ended without agreement, without closure. He was dismissed under escort. As he stepped into the corridor, Milo rose the instant he saw him. Dane felt the tension in those lifted bone plates, restrained but alive with alertness, until he gave the command to stand down. He saw the officers watching behind the glass, nodding the response. He knew, with cold certainty, that the Federation military had stopped asking questions. They had begun planning. Security teams poured into his quarters like a storm, boots pounding against the metal floor, rifles raised and synchronized in a rigid, practiced formation. Milo's ears twitched, his body coiled low to the ground, tail ridges vibrating with a tension that sent shivers through the reinforced walls. The creature's green eyes glowed with a predator's awareness, tracking every movement as if he could anticipate the soldiers' intentions before they even thought to act. Dane's chest tightened, adrenaline spiking as he reached for the control panel that sealed the bulkhead doors. Protocol screamed at him from memory. No interference, no engagement. But the sight of his companion, his responsibility, surrounded by a mechanical army, ignited an instinct he had never thought to feel so acutely outside of field research. "Milo, hold," Dane commanded, his voice firm but calm, carrying authority honed over years of navigating life-or-death situations on worlds no human had dared to tread. Milo's muscles flexed under his dense bone plating, and he obeyed the word, his massive frame lowering slightly yet bristling with latent power, eyes never leaving the intruders. The soldiers advanced, confident in their training and the numerical advantage they assumed would guarantee control. But Milo's presence alone radiated a silent warning, a coiled energy that could not be ignored. Darts streaked through the room, tipped with tranquilizers designed for creatures smaller and less armored, but they ricocheted off Milo's cranial and spinal plates with dull thunks, bouncing harmlessly onto the floor. Dane moved between Milo and the approaching forces, his stance rigid yet protective, hands raised in a gesture that was both command and shield. The soldiers, expecting hesitation from a human confronting a Tier Omega apex, faltered at the sight of Dane's unwavering gaze, but they pressed forward, rifles sweeping. Milo growled, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the metal bulkheads and made the walls themselves seem to recoil. The floor shuddered under the intensity of it, and he felt the vibrations through his boots, reverberating up his legs, through his spine, straight to the pit of his stomach. "Back off, he will defend me," he shouted, projecting authority not just over Milo, but over the chaos around him. The words carried more weight than any weapon could, but the soldiers did not retreat. They underestimated the bond, the synchronization, the hours of trust built in the wilds of Kaldura 9, where survival meant instinct, patience, and respect. Milo's head rose slightly, cranial spikes forward, tail arching, the ghost blue rings along his spine glowing faintly as they caught the flicker of the overhead lights, and every soldier in the room could feel the unspoken danger he embodied. He was containment defying, every movement a demonstration that he was alive, aware, and capable of annihilation if provoked. The military's attempt to push further into the room was met with a coordinated defensive stance from Milo, not yet attacking, but signaling clearly that any further aggression would trigger lethal consequences. Dane's mind raced, calculating, repositioning, maintaining distance between the intruders and the apex predator he had raised. Milo's growl escalated into a low rumble that resonated in tandem with the mechanical hum of the facility, creating an atmosphere of imminent threat without a single strike thrown. Every inch of his posture screamed controlled power, anticipation, and intelligence beyond the soldier's comprehension. The confrontation was suspended in that tense equilibrium, Dane's commands guiding Milo's restraint while projecting dominance to the attackers. The soldiers realized quickly that the darts, the barriers, the numbers, none of it mattered. Milo was both guardian and weapon, perfectly attuned to his will, capable of unleashing violence in a terrifying manner. Every armored chest plate and serrated tail ridge spoke volumes to anyone watching. This was a creature forged by the death world, shaped by predator and prey, and now aligned with a single human, whose voice dictated the difference between restraint and devastation. Dane's gaze swept the room, calculating, commanding, ensuring Milo's obedience would hold even under the weight of multiple assault teams, and the soldiers finally began to grasp that the apex predator before them was not just dangerous. He was utterly untouchable under Dane's guidance. The shot rang out with a finality that ricocheted through the quarters, a high-velocity impact meant to kill, to end Milo's life before Dane's very eyes. The sound pierced the tense silence, and the room seemed to shudder as Dane's heart slammed against his ribs. Milo froze mid-step, ears pinned, pupils widening, the ghost blue rings along his spine catching the light in a sudden, menacing flare. The bone spikes along his shoulders and brow flared outward, cranial plates clinking like warning bells, and his tail whipped in a blur, serrated ridges slicing through the air with an audible hiss. The soldier who had fired the kill shot staggered back, the recoil from the weapon irrelevant against the predator's attention, and every step Milo took toward him seemed to bend the very atmosphere around the room into tension. Dane lunged with pure instinct, tackling the soldier before the man could fire again. His arms wrapped around the assault rifle, twisting it away from its deadly trajectory, and his shouts filled the space with raw authority. Milo, defend! The command was sharp, unwavering, a word that carried the full weight of every hour he had spent earning Milo's trust, every scar, every narrow escape, every shared meal and quiet vigil in the alien wilds of Caldera 9. Milo reacted instantly, a surge of power and precision, every movement calibrated yet wild in its raw potency. His forelimbs launched forward, claws scraping across the reinforced flooring as he struck with the momentum of a falling tree, jaws snapping inches from the soldier who had dared cross him. The green glow of his eyes intensified, pupils vertical slits of predatory focus, cranial spikes lowering with a mechanical precision that made the soldier flinch in horror. The room became a theater of controlled chaos. Soldiers scrambled, their coordinated training collapsing under the sheer unpredictability of Milo's assault, yet every action was restrained, aimed to neutralize threats without unnecessary destruction. Dane rolled to his feet, his body still coiled, eyes locked with Milo's as he barked calculated commands. Hold! Only threats! Milo's growl shifted, resonating through the bulkheads, a vibration that made the metal walls shiver. Each strike, each movement of his tail, each snap of his jaws was measured against his voice, the apex predator synchronizing instinct with command. The soldiers screamed as Milo's tail swung past, the serrated bone ridges whistling inches from flesh, leaving a vivid warning in the air rather than in blood. Other soldiers attempted to flank, moving in disciplined patterns that had worked on lesser species, but Milo adapted instantly, pivoting, climbing the edges of the room with astonishing agility for his size, elbows and shoulder spikes prepared to deflect, to slash, to warn. The air was filled with the hum of tension, the scent of ozone from dart ricochets, the metallic tang of fear from humans facing a creature beyond comprehension. Dane shouted again, precise and sharp, "Milo, no civilians!" And the predator obeyed, each movement a violent ballet restrained by loyalty rather than obedience alone. His massive frame twisted, cranial spikes angled forward, tail arcing in a controlled sweep that cleared corridors and pushed intruders back. Yet he avoided any civilian presence, every inch of his power measured by the man who had raised him. In the midst of the chaos, Dane's mind raced. He calculated exits, weak points in the security formation, the rhythm of Milo's attacks, every potential danger, every opportunity. His shouts guided the Vornok with perfect clarity, a conductor of raw, destructive force now under his singular control. Milo's eyes never left him, every green glint reflecting intelligence and trust, the culmination of months spent shaping an apex predator into a partner without breaking the essence of what it was born to be. And then, as the last soldier hesitated, caught between awe and terror, Milo's massive head swung low, cranial spikes folding back, tail coiling, his posture softening on Dane's whispered command. Easy. The transition was instantaneous, terrifying power bending to gentle obedience in a heartbeat, leaving the room trembling with the unspoken truth. No human force could claim this creature except the one who had earned him. Milo exploded into the corridor like a predator unleashed, every ounce of muscle driving him forward with terrifying speed. Walls buckled under the weight of his armored shoulders, steel doors crumpling beneath rams from cranial spikes. His tail lashed out, serrated ridges slicing through reinforced glass, concrete, and armored suits with savage precision. Screams tore through the bay as soldiers were thrown aside like rag dolls, limbs snapping under the force of his strikes. The green glow of his eyes pierced through smoke and debris, pupils vertical, predatory, untamed. He vaulted over the first barricade, claws raking armor, rending metal and flesh alike. The sound was a chorus of ripping steel, cracking bones, and grinding concrete. Each leap sent sparks flying, twisted the framework of the walls, and shattered any illusion of safety. Milo's jaw clamped down on a mechanized suit, tearing through reinforced plating like paper, the soldier inside reduced to a screaming heap, thrown aside without a second thought. Behind him, the bay erupted into chaos. Alarms blared, lights flickered, but Milo was no longer part of the world that had tried to cage him. Soldiers scrambled, firing everything they had, but bullets ricocheted off bone plating. Explosions erupted where tail strikes met weapon racks, panels shredded, consoles ripped from mounts, fragments raining down. Milo climbed walls effortlessly, claws hooking metal beams, hurling himself at anything moving. He twisted midair, cranial spikes ramming through reinforced doors, tearing them from their hinges. His tail whipped through corridors, carving deep trenches in the floor, flinging bodies and equipment into the air. His growls shook the structure itself, a deep, sonorous roar that made hearts stop and knees buckle. Dane ran alongside, voice cutting through the bedlam, barely keeping pace. "Milo, here!" The predator pivoted, reared up, and vaulted over another squad, crashing down on their formation like an avalanche. Limbs flailed in the air, screams ended in silence, the floor littered with shattered armor and broken bodies. Milo moved too fast, too big, too deadly, a living weapon of destruction. His ghost stripes flashed as he twisted, almost invisible in motion, eyes glinting venom green, teeth bared, tail ripping apart the last line of barricade. Nothing could stop him. A single strike of his cranial spikes tore through reinforced machinery. Limbs, torsos, weapons, all irrelevant. Milo was a force of pure annihilation, an apex predator in full terrifying glory. Sparks flew, alarms shattered, walls groaned under each impact, and the smell of burning circuits and blood filled the air. Soldiers tried to regroup, but Milo was everywhere at once, climbing, jumping, swinging, ramming, biting, tail slicing, armor plating cracking under the assault. The entire hangar shook, as if the planet itself had risen against them. Amid the carnage, Dane's voice barely carried. "Milo, stop!" He didn't have to restrain him. Milo simply turned, eyes glowing, letting Dane pass, then spun back into the chaos. Bone spikes raking anything that moved, tail cleaving through mechanized suits like they were nothing. The predator's sonic growl reverberated like a shockwave, dropping soldiers to their knees, leaving chaos in every corner. There was no mercy, no calculation, only pure, unfiltered apex predation unleashed. Every strike, every bite, every tail sweep was a statement. Milo was no longer a creature to be feared. He was the nightmare the galaxy had whispered about, a tier-omega predator realized in bone, claw, and raw, unending fury. The bay lay in ruins, alarms screaming, metal twisted, bodies strewn across the floor, and Milo's glowing eyes roamed like twin predators. One word from Dane, barely spoken over the bedlam, was enough to stop him momentarily. Then the storm would continue, unstoppable, terrifying, untamed. The hangar reeked of smoke and scorched metal, sparks arcing from shattered control panels that littered the floor. Milo moved with terrifying precision behind Dane, his massive forelimbs pounding against steel grates and overturned crates, tail whipping, serrated ridges slicing through the nearest obstacle. Soldiers had regrouped at the far end, trying to form a line, but Milo's growl rolled through the bay like thunder, reverberating across reinforced walls, forcing the first rows to stumble backward. Dane kept low, muscles coiled, rifle slung across his shoulder as he calculated every step toward the shuttle at the rear of the hangar. Milo crushed and cleaved through everything in his path. Metal bent, concrete cracked, and the stench of burnt circuitry filled the air as he pivoted on powerful hind legs, swinging his tail in a blur that shredded armor plating and sent sparks cascading across the ceiling. A soldier tried to flank them, reaching for a rifle, but Milo turned, the snap of his jaw loud enough to make bone and metal groan. The soldier never fired. Milo's venom-green eyes glowed, pupils vertical, and the faint predatory shimmer of his ghost stripes made him appear almost spectral in the dim light. He charged in a single, fluid movement, slamming into the man with the force of a battering ram. The floor cracked under the impact, and the soldier was thrown across the hangar, hitting a stack of crates that splintered under his weight. Dane sprinted, vaulting over debris, hand on the shuttle's access panel, fingers working frantically to override the hatch lock. Milo followed, claw tips gouging fresh streaks into the steel floor, bone spikes catching the emergency lights as he twisted and swiped through another approaching soldier. The screech of armor tearing and the high-pitched cries of those foolish enough to challenge him filled the bay. Sparks danced along Milo's tail as he swung it with brutal accuracy, slicing through reinforced doors that blocked the far side of the hangar. Each impact reverberated through the concrete metal groaning in protest, but Milo did not hesitate. Another soldier aimed a plasma rifle at Dane, fingers tightening on the trigger. Milo's head snapped up, fangs bared, jaw muscles coiling with explosive force. He lunged before the man could react, teeth sinking into reinforced plating, snapping it like paper. The soldier collapsed, screaming, the rifle clattering across the floor. He swung the shuttle hatch open just as Milo pivoted, catching a third soldier mid-charge and hurling him aside with a violent spin. The massive creature bounded onto the access ramp, claws gouging deep channels into the alloy as he landed beside Dane. The ramp groaned under Milo's weight, but the Vornok's stride never faltered. He hit the ignition sequence, thrusters sparking to life, shoving the shuttle forward. Milo pressed close, bone plates brushing the edge of the cockpit, eyes sweeping the hangar one last time, alert, predatory, untamed. Sparks leapt from the shattered panels as the rear doors began to close. The shuttle rose, engines screaming, shaking the structure as they cleared the hangar. Outside, the station fell away beneath them, a burning maze of steel and smoke. Dane leaned back in his seat, heart hammering, Milo coiled beside him, tail flicking, ears alert. Dane keyed the comms, voice steady, low. "Nobody follows. If anyone comes for me or Milo, there will be consequences." Milo exhaled, a low, resonant growl that vibrated the cockpit floor, a warning and a promise, lethal and precise. The dark expanse of space stretched ahead, every heartbeat synchronized to the rhythm of their escape, every movement a silent vow that no force in the galaxy could challenge them. Milo's venom-green eyes swept the interior, the faint shimmer of his ghost stripes catching the light, lethal and magnificent, yet tethered entirely to Dane. The shuttle roared through space, engines screaming against the void, and Dane allowed himself a single steady breath, knowing they were still in transit, still unreachable, and that home, when they returned, would be waiting, untamed, as wild and unforgiving as the bond he had forged with Milo. They land back on the planet where it all began. The shuttle's thrusters hissed and groaned as it settled onto the roughened landing pad, sending small dust clouds spiraling into the still, alien air. The outpost rose ahead, scarred but intact, a testament to years of careful survival. Beyond it, the wild stretched endlessly, distant howls echoing through jagged valleys, the predatory calls of creatures Dane had catalogued and survived alongside. Milo walked beside him, silent but immense, his massive paws sinking slightly into the packed soil with every step, tail low but alert, eyes flicking constantly to the surrounding wilderness. His armor plates shimmered faintly, the broken ghost stripes along his spine catching it in a subtle, spectral pattern. There was no tension now, no immediate threat, only the shared understanding of everything they had endured and overcome together. Life returned gradually to the rhythm they had carved for themselves, the careful tracking of prey, the cautious exploration of uncharted canyons, the meticulous study of flora and microfauna, the shared survival lessons that had cemented trust over countless days and nights, and the unspoken bonding that had grown into a partnership impossible to break. Dane's hand brushed Milo's armored shoulder as they moved, a gesture of calm and recognition. A man and a monster, a scientist and the apex predator he had raised, moving as one through a world that had tried to break them both. The path back to the outpost was rough but familiar, each step a measure of regained control and reclaimed life. Milo's head lifted slightly, ears tilting toward distant sounds, but his posture remained relaxed, obedient to Dane's presence. When they reached the threshold of the outpost, Milo settled beside him, massive and imposing yet calm, lowering his armored head into Dane's lap without hesitation. Dane's fingers traced the jagged ridges along Milo's skull, the ultimate testament to trust, a living confirmation that the bond they had forged could not be severed. Dane pulled out his datapad and began a new log, voice low but steady, recording each word with deliberate care. Day 1 of the Vornok domestication project. Subject name, Milo. Let's see where this goes. The outpost seemed alive again, a center for study, survival, and partnership. Beyond the walls, the untamed world waited, indifferent and dangerous, yet for the first time fully shared between the human and the apex predator. Dane leaned back against a reinforced support beam, Milo's massive form pressed close, warmth radiating from the living armor. For a moment, nothing moved but the low hum of life returning to the wilds. The bond was complete, unbroken, and infinite in its scope.